we're excited to be joined today by Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson to talk about Trump's impeachment. Thanks, guys, for being on. You're more on the Shapiro train, huh?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Peterson. I enjoy Shapiro, actually. I don't agree with a lot of his stuff. Very well articulated, and
there you go. Cool.
Yeah.
Before we get into today's podcast update about the future of the show, I'm actually probably going to be taking a little bit more of a back seat in the future. I'm working on a new podcast potentially called That Jesus Podcast. Pretty, lame name perhaps, but kind of catchy, I thought. And so I'm working on it, and it's going to be a podcast that's sort of addressing apathy that I see within and exploring maybe some potential cures for that apathy, such as the classic spiritual disciplines such as prayer, meditation, on fasting, and the idea that if we really encounter God through those spiritual disciplines, that he will empower us to care for the poor and make disciples of the nation. So that's sort of my passion for the new project I'm working on, and I'm currently lining up guests for it. It'll probably be actually a little while before any episodes come out, but if anyone's interested in that, you can find it at That Jesus Pod, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You can just like it, and maybe 5 years from now when the first episode comes out, you can enjoy. A little call out on social media for anyone who might be interested in helping run this podcast and sort of it with the Russell. And one of the gents who got in touch with me is another David Pallmann. The primary reason why I think he's qualified is because his first name is also David, and we've all seen how David Russell owned all the skeptics who've come on our show, and we're superstitious around here. We believe in crazy superstitious things, and so that superstition extends even to believing in the power of the first name. So I really do think David Pallmann is potentially qualified candidate to help host this show, but we will find out because he's going to be cutting his teeth on his first debate today. More about David on his YouTube channel, Faith Because of Reason. And before we introduce his interlocutor, who already chimed in about his Jordan Peterson, David Pallmann, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live, where you're from, your social security number, voting for in 2020, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so thank you so much, guys, for having me on today. As you said, my name is David Pallmann. I study ministry and apologetics at Trinity Theological Seminary. I have a YouTube channel, as you said, Faith Because of Reason, currently going through a series on intelligent design, so I'm glad that we're discussing this because unlike some other topics that I defend, I wouldn't be as studied up on them, so I feel prepared enough to discuss intelligent design. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Joining us also on the Skype line, Jared McComb. Jared was on I think the first or second episode we ever dropped on this show. He's the founder of the Atheist Community of Charlottesville and also helped start the newly minted Reason2Doubt podcast. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
With Jordan, who's been on our show more times than I can count. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Jared.
Yeah, no problem. Jordan and I were talking about this the other day. The topics that Jordan appeared on were probably topics that I was more qualified to talk about. And the topic they were talking he's more qualified to talk about. But first of all, I want to thank everybody for letting me on here. And David, I'll say your YouTube channel, man, the production level of that is pretty impressed with that, and enjoyed watching some of your videos there. So
thank you. I enjoyed listening to some of your podcasts.
Yeah. Well, a little bit about me. Yeah, I'm an atheist. Kind of went through seminary, studied at Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary, and during that process, we didn't have a reason to believe anymore, and now I'm out there apostatizing.
There you go. You have apostatized. You're no
I
longer.
have.
Great. Well, David Russell, from now on, I'm just going to call you Russell, and I'm going to call the other David. Russell, why don't you introduce the topic that we're going to be tackling here tonight and sort of set up the conversation for us?
Awesome. As we alluded to, it's about intelligent design, a theory that simply says that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained, not in an undirected process, natural selection. And that's what we're going to kind of David give his opening presentation, about 7 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to go to Jared and give his rebuttal or opening statement to proceed, and then we're just going to dive into a friendly conversation. And guys, we're going to let you guys discuss it, and like I said, we're just we need to redirect, or if we need to have something explained better for the audience, that's really what we're going to do. So David, if you could appreciate it.
Yeah, so again, I just want to say if I, really do a terrible job and get my rear end handed to me tonight, I just want to be clear to the audience that doesn't mean that intelligent design is a bad theory. It just means I'm a bad spokesman for it. So please don't judge the theory itself by my presentation of it. But to get right to it, intelligent design, as you said, should be defined as the study of patterns in nature that are best explained as the result of an intelligent cause rather than an unintelligent cause. Intelligent design is an inference to intelligence as being the best explanation for certain features of the universe in general and biological complexity in particular. An interesting thing about this debate is that nearly everybody in this debate agrees that biological organisms at least look designed. Richard Dawkins, a prominent atheist evolutionary biologist, defines biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, Darwinists say that this design is an illusion that's created by natural selection. But we design theorists, we disagree. We believe that the design is actual because the mechanisms proposed by evolutionists are very limited. So limited, in fact, that they demonstrably cannot be the sole explanation for all of the complexity and diversity of life. And in order for me to accept evolution, then I would require evidence in two areas. One, empirical evidence. I need evidence that some sort of natural process, like natural selection or some sort of natural process, has the ability, has the causal adequacy to give rise to the sorts of complexity that we see in biological organisms. So we need empirical evidence. And then secondly, I need historical evidence that this change has actually taken place. So those are the two sort of pillars and two sorts of areas that I think evolutionists need to defend. Now, I think there's actually really good reasons to reject both of these points. For example, we've been evolving bacteria and fruit flies in labs for a long time now, and we've seen some interesting variations of bacteria and fruit flies, but they have always remained as bacteria and fruit flies. There seems to be an inherent limit or an edge to evolvability, or how far you can get something to change. And note that because these creatures reproduce so quickly, especially in the case of bacteria, we're able to see like thousands of generations pass by. Lenski's been growing bacteria since like the 90s, and so we've had plenty of time to see any serious evolution that could happen. We should have seen something happen by now. Now, Neo-Darwinism proposes that natural selection acting on random mutations is what has caused the diversity of life on Earth. However, any view that depends on mutations as the primary cause for how new organisms are built is doomed to failure because of the problem of embryonic lethals. And this problem basically describes the fact that any mutation that could affect the body structure of an organism must take place in the early stages of embryonic development. Mutations taking place in the mid or late stages cannot affect the body structure. However, mutations that take place in the early stages of embryonic development are virtually always fatal. This, of course, means that changes that affect the body structure cannot be passed on genetically, and therefore mutations cannot be the explanation for the development of new body structures. Now, there are two types of causes that we have experience with. These would be intelligent causes and then unintelligent or natural causes. Now, intelligent design realizes that there's a way to tell the difference between these two types of causes. Intelligent causes leave behind certain distinctive traits or earmarks that are empirically detectable. And when something exhibits some of these distinctive traits, then it's said to exhibit specified complexity. Now, specified complexity refers to something that is contingent, complex, as well as specified, which means it provides a specific function or it conforms to an independently given pattern. That would be William Dembski's given criteria for determining if something is designed or not. Design is an acceptable explanation in, various fields of study. For example, archaeology. If archaeologists discover pottery, arrowheads, or hieroglyphics, no one insists that these artifacts must be explained by purely natural causes such as wind, water, and erosion. Instead, we realize that because no known natural cause can account for the origin of these artifacts, but we know that intelligence can account for it, and so that makes intelligence the best explanation of these. So analogously, we would say in biological organisms, we have detected certain traits or earmarks only known to be produced by intelligence, and so that makes intelligence the best explanation for them, hence intelligent design. So when I appeal to ID as the best explanation, by best explanation, I mean a cause that is presently known to produce the effect in question. I contend that there are examples of things in nature that contain features only known to be produced by intelligent agents. And I'll give 3 specific examples of where I believe intelligent design can be detected in nature, and these will function as my arguments for intelligent design. So first, the origin of life. It's almost universally acknowledged that there are currently no viable models for how life might have arisen naturalistically. Early theories of chemical evolution and chance have fallen by the wayside. We're no closer to explaining life's origin naturalistically than we ever were. And this has been complicated by the discovery that life depends upon DNA to sequence proteins, the proteins that build living organisms. Now, DNA is a 4-character digital code, and that is, in a very rigorous sense, information. And this has kicked biology off into an information age, and has shown us that the question of life's origin is now equivalent to the question of information's origin. Our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past, consistently has shown us that information only arises from intelligent minds. Thus, the best explanation for the origin of information in DNA is intelligence. Irreducible complexity in microbiological machines. Basically, irreducible complexity is the idea that certain biological features must have all of their parts in place at once in order to function. The complexity is said to be irreducible because you cannot remove or modify any parts of it and keep the function. Darwinian evolution depends on numerous small changes accumulating over time and being preserved through natural selection. That means that every single change has to confer some benefit to the organism. In order for natural selection to sorry, I lost my place there. That means that every single change has to confer some benefit to the organism. Otherwise, natural selection will select it out. The problem is that irreducibly complex things, such as the bacterial flagellum, do not function unless all of them exist at once. So if one part is missing from the bacterial flagellum, it doesn't just function at 89% or at 90%, it doesn't function at all. So there's no plausible pathway that mutations could ever build this, because it would take a lot of mutations to get it built. But since no mutation provides a beneficial function without the other mutations happening simultaneously, the mutations that would ultimately lead to the creation of the flagellum would be selected out. And the only way to overcome such a problem is by foresight. Foresight is a property of intelligent agents, therefore we invoke intelligent design. Now, it is important to realize that there is a logical, an empirical, and an explanatory part to this argument. The logical part is that Darwinian evolution, by definition, cannot build an irreducibly complex organism. Darwinism is a blind process that cannot plan for the future. It does not have any goals in sight. And as such, it could never directly build an irreducibly complex system one step at a time. Now, the Darwinists might try to opt for an indirect pathway, and the empirical point is that we are currently lacking any hard scientific data for an indirect pathway to create irreducibly complex systems. So then finally, the explanatory point is that we do know that foresight, a property of intelligent beings, can overcome these problems, and that makes intelligence the best explanation. Third and finally, the origin of new body structures. Not only is information required to get first life, but it is required to get any new structures or functions. Evolution tries to have this information build slowly, and then is preserved in organisms, and it's passed on. The biological information is just supposed to accumulate and then diversify via the theory of universal common ancestry or common descent. However, the theory of common descent faces severe challenges, most strongly from the fossil record. If universal common descent were true, then we would expect to see a gradual tree-like pattern with lots of intermediate forms gradually emerging into the types of animals we see around us today. However, the general rule in paleontology is discontinuity. The fossil record shows many explosions and radiations of animals appearing suddenly with no obvious evolutionary precursors, suggesting that new animals did not evolve from a common ancestor. This means that large quantities of biological information came into existence suddenly rather than slowly. And this is perhaps most starkly evident in the Cambrian explosion, which has a minimum of 13 new phyla appearing within a 5 to 6 million year window, and that's a mere blink in geological time. There are no plausible candidates for ancestors or precursors to these Cambrian animals. This speaks to intelligent design as being the best explanation for the new forms of life, because intelligent agents can create vast quantities of information and complex structures suddenly, while natural forces in our experience cannot. So all these points taken together, I think, provide strong evidence for intelligent design and good reasons to be skeptical of the causal power of evolution.
Great job. Great job. Thank you very much. To you, buddy.
All right, man. Thanks. Thank you, David, for that. So, first of all, I'd like to say I am by no means an expert in evolution or none of that stuff. So, 50% of what you said just went over my head. But that doesn't mean that it's not, you can't explain it. So we can break things down into simpler terms and try to attack them from that point. So I contend that in order for intelligent design, it needs to be able to produce repeatable tests and present hypotheses which can be falsified. So this is something which proponents have able to do to this point. So I agree that we are able to detect and infer intelligence in a great many things. So these infamous watch, for example, we can see that it is designed, but we know that it's designed because we compare it to other things that are designed and think. So the same goes for a painting or a car. So a lot of ID proponents will say we have a paint and it requires a painter. So we have design requires a designer. These analogies come into play a lot. But just because something is doesn't mean it was designed. So for example, we have things that we attribute purpose to. So mountain, but that doesn't mean that the purpose of the mountain is for me to ski on it. Like it's the same thing. Like I can use the stars to navigate at night, but that doesn't mean the purpose of the stars is for navigation, right? So we apply purpose to things as humans. The same thing goes with design. We infer design, design. So one of the techniques used by idea proponents is to make analogies to lend credit to their claims. You know, for example, the in his natural theology, he wrote in 1802, he said that he compared the human eye to the watch. He claimed that just as we can see a watch as designed, the human eye was designed. But this is a fallacious argument. It's a false analogy, and to some extent, it could be considered the fallacy of composition, meaning that what is true for one thing is also true for the whole. And so, because that argument is fallacious, we can literally just throw it out. Of ID claim that evolution can explain the diversity of life we see in the world, but that's simply not true. We have a tremendous amount of evidence. And they will point to examples that claim natural selection have no explanatory power for. So we've already heard the bacterial flagellum, irreducible complexity, a common descent, these things. But there's a failure to understand the actual arguments. And just because you have arguments doesn't mean that the arguments don't hold water. So the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. The majority, if not all of science is built on natural selection, so evolution. And evolution by means of natural best explanation for the diversity of life on this planet. It is the simplest explanation that accounts for the most variables, and there's no need to invoke it. We see this process bore out over and over again in geology, comparative anatomy, DNA, all of these things which ID against the scientific community are actually things that support evolution. So the more we discover through the scientific method, the more we confirm evolution. There's not one instance where a scientific discovery has actually overturned the theory of natural selection or evolution. Claims that there are justifiable design inferences. So basically, they believe that intelligence is detectable in nature. We've already heard this, but the are at best inconclusive and at least fallacious for the most part. ID critique is wrong. So you may be familiar with the Kitzmiller versus Dover case in 2005. This is when they were trying intelligence design into the classroom. One of the judges who heard the case, the Supreme Court judge, John E. Jones III, he said, the ID represents the status of the theory of evolution in the scientific community. Causes students to doubt its validity without scientific justification, religious alternative masquerading as scientific theory, and instructs students to forego scientific inquiry. So ID is not be tested. There's no evidence, research, or any hypothesis to test. They will point to examples of things that seem improbable. Because they're improbable doesn't mean that they're impossible. So that's basically it. Like what happens here with most important, it's a failure to understand. And when they don't understand, they point to God as the only possible explanation. I could go probably better at this point that we actually have some back and forth conversation. And I'd just like to say, that just because we don't understand doesn't mean that there has to be a supernatural explanation. It's okay to say, I don't know. And that's the one thing that I am saying is I don't know a lot of stuff. In fact, the stuff that I don't know is, so anyway, is all I had for the start. I'd rather just have some conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jared. We appreciate that. Thing that just stood out to me, and maybe we can go in this direction and start talking about this in the conversation point is, what do you mean by what understand? What do people not understand about evolution? What is the most common things people are not understanding? I know you're in the lines den, so I'm not picking on you.
No, that's fine. Fine. So basically, the theory of evolution it's fact. It's proven out more and more by science, but it is a understand. We're talking about deep time here. The inability for humans to grasp deep time and small changes over time is very, very, just because somebody who is not an expert in the field of biology doesn't understand something, or because they don't understand it, it's not correct, right? And so that's what I mean. It's a failure to understand. It's like they see the evidence, or they listen to, they accept it, basically, or they just think that the evidence is wrong. But the majority of the scientific community would beg.
Yeah. I think I'm with you on part of that too. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding about evolution. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and sometimes I don't even think it's people just refusing to believe these. I think it just for some people it just soars head. But
Yeah,
David,
sure.
do you have
Sorry,
Go ahead.
you cut out right at the end there. I heard you say my name.
Oh yeah, I was just a response for Jared on what he just said.
Well, yeah, sure. I appreciate you asking him what he meant by failure to understand, because I thought he was saying that ID proponents don't understand evolution. But I think what you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like what you meant when he asked you was that you actually meant that because we don't understand how something works, therefore we shouldn't attribute it to design. Was that what you were
Yeah.
saying? A lot of it is that we don't understand how evolution
Basically,
works?
some of that is the case. Some of it is that, like David was saying, these concepts are so large that and can't understand them too, or there's just a failure to actually accept them as well. I mean, I'm not suggesting you don't understand the because you probably know more about it than I do, but.
Well, I mean that's not necessarily true, but let me back up here on one thing. You said that we needed to make repeatable tests and that we had to be falsified, right?
Not necessarily falsified. I mean, it'd be nice if you were falsified, but it'd make this argument a lot easier.
Sorry,
It needs to be
falsifiable.
Your arguments need to be falsifiable. Yeah.
Okay, so let me take that one first. Intelligent design, I think, is easily falsifiable. All Darwinists would have to do to falsify intelligent design is take an example of something that we contend is a product of design. I brought up DNA earlier. All they need to do is tell us that the information in DNA can be accounted for by naturalistic processes. Intelligent design is falsified. I brought up the bacterial flagellum as well. Show us how a bacterial flagellum can evolve without, by naturalistic processes. Intelligent design is falsified. So intelligent design is very easy to falsify, as I understand it. Before I go on to the other point, I didn't want to give you a chance to, say.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, take DNA, for example. Now, if we're talking about the origins of life, simply, I don't know. And nobody's going to claim that they know where life came from. But this argument about the origins of life, that's a completely different topic. And science does show that natural selection can account for the information being passed on from one to another. And the bacterial flagellum is a common go-to. It's like a child for intelligent design. But there's been studies all the time that show that the most common one studied is the bacteria E. coli. And I had some, but let me see if I can pull it up here. Basically, so it goes down to, I'll try to keep it simple. You're making an argument, basically, that you have all these pieces of a mousetrap, and without every single piece of that mousetrap being there, the mousetrap ceases to get from all these. Like, you can't have a board with a flappy thing and then all of a sudden jump to a board with a flappy thing and a spring and a hinge. But that's not what happens in evolution. Just because you don't see the changes doesn't mean they're not there. And over and over with bacteria is like you're claiming that there is a system where all the things have to work at the same time, or they don't work at all. What you're failing to see is that some of these things may have been there for different purposes in previous generations. So, for example, like the turbine part may have performed a different function in an earlier mutation, and then so I don't know if that makes sense. So you're jumping to the end state and saying this doesn't work without it all being put in at the same time, but that's not what happens in evolution.
Sure.
That's one of the failures to see how evolution.
Sure, I think I understand that, and that would be called the co-option theory. Kenneth Miller made that popular in the trial that you mentioned before in his argument against Michael Behe. Now, it is true that for the flagellum in particular, you've got about 10 parts of it that serve as a pump and in other organisms. So the problem is you've got 30 unique parts to it that you don't have in other organisms, so you still have to account for these other 30 parts, as well as give us a plausible Darwinian pathway for how these 30 parts plus the 10 parts that are in other systems, how this got fashioned into the flagellum. Furthermore, I would point out that the organism that has these 10 parts in it most likely evolved after the bacterial flagellum. So this is something that wouldn't, like Behe and others think it didn't even exist prior to the flagellum, which means we could be seeing an example of devolution, that is, where we have loss of function. So I don't know that it's a failure to understand it. I just think that the criticism perhaps to some extent misses the point of irreducible complexity. Because irreducible complexity, we need a way of how we get from these parts to the whole. And what ID is claiming is that that this can't happen by blind processes. So it's not enough to like show that you've got some parts of it in another system. What we need is an explanation of how these parts became.
So, right. I'm not a biologist, so I can't explain how bacterial flagellum works. But here's an example of where the ID movement has gone. So the poster child for irreducible complexity used to be the human eye, and so for the longest time they would point to the used to be complex. But as we've shown over and over, Richard Dawkins does a great job of doing this, showing how the eye could have, even with different parts performing different functions at different stages, and then we get to the human eye. Now we're at a point now where you don't even bring up the human eye anymore. Theory has been debunked that it's irreducibly complex. We can prove that the eye is not irreducibly complex. The same thing has happened with the bacterial flagellum. Prove that it is not irreducibly complex, but because it's such a small thing and it's so complicated and so detailed, I don't understand. And so you have these catchy phrases and things that people are going to hear, and then they're going to be like, oh, well, that makes sense. But it's really not. If you ask biologists, they can show you how the bacterial flagellum is not irreducibly complex.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so for example, there 23 proteins in the bacteria E. coli, right? There's 40 different kinds, but you have thousands of variations of these. So either some of these flagellum cease to exist or cease to function, which is not the case. They actually function, but out of these thousands, they function. So I don't understand how you can say that it's the case when they all function and they don't have the same makeup are in all the other variations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, let me see if I understand you. So you were saying that because parts of the flagellum are used in other biological systems, that this therefore means that they don't have to be assembled as the flagellum to serve function. Is that correct?
No, there's variations of the flagellum that have different makeups and don't have all the same parts. So some parts, some have 23, some have 30, but they all function. So that right there shows that it's not irreducibly complex, that some of them can function without having all the parts. They may have different,
Yeah,
so
I mean, Jared, finish your point.
No, that's right.
Okay. All right, Dave, just for the audience's sake, could you explain what the flagellum is? And then
rebut it.
So,
Sure. Can you rebut the atheist?
Or
give your response.
Sure. So the bacterial flagellum is like it's in a cell, and it functions much like an outboard motor does on a boat, right? So it's got a propeller and a drive shaft, and it's this whip-like tail that spins around, and that propels it through water. And I'm sorry, what was the second thing I was supposed to do?
Rebut the atheist.
Oh, rebut the atheist. And that's what I'm here for, right? All right. So let's take this down. Well, you're saying that we can have a bacterial flagellum that's comprised of fewer parts.
Yes.
Which study or source did you get that from, if I could ask?
I don't have it on me, bro.
Oh, it's okay if you
But that's how it works. Yeah.
don't.
You can put it in the show notes.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll look for it afterwards, and I'll see if I can post it for you.
Sure, yeah, that's cool. So we go to one with, so you said we could have one with like 23 parts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have one that do we know of any that are fewer than that?
I don't know. The source that I showed was just talking about that specific example.
Okay.
So
Now, I'm saying, Behe has made the point that there's like a minimum complexity threshold, right? So, I'm not sure. I'm not, sure on the claim that you can have them with fewer parts. That's why I was interested in your source on that. But I think we can take the argument and go with it anyway. It seems that even if you can have one with fewer parts, eventually we're gonna come to a flagellum with a minimum complexity threshold that is going to be irreducibly complex, right? You can only take away so much from it. So so maybe 23.
well, that's where it goes back to what I was saying earlier. So in the earlier stages, those parts could have had different functions and served a different purpose. So, for example, if you look at the wing of a bird, right? At some point, the wing along the evolution process is going to be so small and like it's not going to be good for flight. And you'll say, well, obviously because there's no reason to have a wing that doesn't function. But that could have had different purposes in the past, and they've shown that the evolution used for heat, radiation, radiated off in heat. It could have been used for propulsion, for moving faster on the ground. Even though it couldn't fly, they could serve different purposes in the past. And because we don't see the purposes that they have now, how they could have been used in earlier mutations doesn't useful in an earlier stage. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm trying to say.
No, it does. Yeah, and I appreciate the point you're making there, but I think the point with irreducible complexity is with a bacterial flagellum, it doesn't get built without its parts, right? So there's not going to be another function that they can be serving because the thing is not going to be alive if it doesn't have these parts. So you have to have all.
That's no. You see, that's where I think you're wrong. You're looking at the parts as they are now and saying this couldn't function without all these parts together. But what I'm saying is that these parts could have had which would have served different purposes in an earlier, stage. I think that's where the confusion maybe. I don't.
Gotcha. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so then I guess what we need then is empirical support that you can have this earlier stage evolve into a bacterial flagellum. As I was saying, I made 3 points with the flagellum. I said there's a logical point that there is definitely not a direct Darwinian pathway there. So then the second point is that there is no plausible pathway. We have no empirical evidence that you actually can have that happen. I mean, it's an interesting theory, but then the question is, do we have empirical evidence that can actually happen?
Well, I would turn it back on you and say, do we have empirical evidence that a designer made it happen? I mean, you can't have it both. Either you can infer that a designer made it, and I can also infer that it had different purposes, and you can't have the argument both ways, and they've produced models showing how these bacterial flagellum could have evolved now. I'll try to find the source because I did look that up and post it. But
sure, yeah, and I would appreciate that. Okay. So
what do you think about my question there about the inference there?
Well, I think we have to make an inference to the best explanation, right? So the question is, you would have to provide empirical data that this can happen before we can make an inference to that as being the best explanation, right? Whether that is what did happen or whether it was intelligently designed, we're obviously, unless we can time travel, we're not going to ever actually know how it came about.
My question to you was, what is your empirical evidence that a designer made it happen?
Well, we do know that designers have foresight, that designers can create irreducibly complex systems, right? I mean, it happens all the time. So, you used a watch before, right? We know that a designer can make that from our experience. Intelligent designers have foresight. So there is a sense in which we do have empirical evidence that things that are irreducibly complex can be made by intelligent designers. What we are lacking is empirical data that naturalistic forces can create these things. So I think that makes intelligence the best explanation, because in our experience,
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, but you're putting in words in there that aren't actually like useful. So naturalistic forces don't create anything, right? The natural selection process is what determines things happen along the way, but there's no natural force creating anything.
Yeah,
And so by stating that, it's putting in words to imply that it has to be created when it's not necessary. The natural is demonstrated to work.
well, that's what I mean. I'm sorry if I used a bad term there before with forces, but natural process, right? The process of natural selection. What I'm saying is that we are lacking empirical support that natural selection can actually do that. And so, since we do know from our experience that intelligence can do that, then it seems like intelligence becomes the best explanation.
Well, that's where you get to the false analogy again. Is you're saying we see the designer designs things, and so this appears design implies a designer, but the key word there is appears design. Okay, so appears design doesn't mean it was designed, and I think that's where like ID really tries to focus on is the appearance of design. Comparisons and analogies to try to make it seem like it is designed when in fact it's not actually designed, it's just the natural process. And the evidence is there. It's in the fossil record, it's in the DNA, it's in the common ancestry, common descent, which it's funny that those three things you are using as arguments against evolution, but those are probably the strongest evidences for evolution.
All right, we can talk about that then if you want to turn over to that, unless you want to keep battling it out with the bacterial flagellum.
I would rather not, because the bacterial flagellum is like the most complex thing, and I have really no idea what I'm talking about.
Is it irreducibly complex or just complex?
No, it's not irreducibly complex. There's plenty of studies that show that the bacterial flagellum is not irreducibly complex, and I think that's the main point that I want to hit on.
Yeah, why don't we hinge it a little bit? And Jared, would you want to make sort of a positive case for evolution and have Pallmann respond to it?
I mean, I could, but I think the positive case for evolution is made by the fact that it's a theory, capital T, fact of science that evolution is true. There's no disputing it. Been falsified. There's never been any evidence to the contrary to contradict evolution. I mean, it would be a positive case in 3 minutes for evolution.
Yeah, I mean, we're already on this course. If I could interject, I mean, on another topic really quick here. What I'm basically hearing Jared say is that it's kind of out of the gaps type thing that the ID proponents are using. Idea you propose. But you asked for some. Am I correct in assuming that?
No, I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's a god of the gaps. I mean, I think that's originally where ID came from, but I think that's a little tenuous to say that it's a god of the gaps argument, because that's basically saying, well, I don't understand it, therefore God, but that's not what ID proponents say. I mean, it wouldn't go that far. I think David agreed too. It's not a god of the gaps argument.
Yes, I agree.
But throw some at David, because David and you got after Jared there first, and I wanted to say, talking about empirical data. Okay, does ID make predictions where we can test?
I did want to get to that. Yeah, sorry, we got kind of bogged down and on the flagellum, but So first we need to be clear that there is a difference between origin science and operation science, right? Or historical sciences and empirical sciences. So when we're talking about empirical sciences or operation sciences, we are talking about things that you can repeat and things that you can test in a laboratory. However, when we're talking about like origin science or forensic science, we're talking about something in the past. And these are things that have different rules that apply to them. And this is not just ID proponents who are saying this. This is an acknowledged fact, just of the way science operates. The Big Bang, you can't go and have that happen again in a laboratory. This is something that only happened once. So you have very different methods that apply to that in science. We don't have to repeat the Big Bang to know that the Big Bang happened, right? We don't have to repeat the origin of life to know how it happened. And for that matter, when it comes to repeatability here, since we can't repeat the origin of life, since this is only something that happens once, this is something that we are going to have to assess then by forensic methods. So that's why I appeal to inference to the best explanation. That is something that is currently known to produce the effects, which is information, DNA. What do we know that produces information in our experience? And it's not unguided natural process. It's intelligent mind. And so then I would say intelligence becomes the best explanation for the origin of information in DNA.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good. Good.
And that's, but that borderlines being a god of the gaps, because what you're saying is like I can't see how naturally, or this could result naturally. Therefore, I'm going to infer that it was a supernatural cause. But just because understand something doesn't mean that we get to claim that God did it. And so you're into another level there. And I was gonna say one more thing about irreducible complexity.
All right, could I make one correction?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying if that was the argument I was making, that I don't know what made DNA, so it must have been God or a supernatural force, that would be God of the gaps. But that wasn't actually the argument that I gave. The argument was that I was saying we do know what causes the information that life is based on. We know what causes information, and that is intelligence. So God of the gaps omits positive evidence, but I'm not omitting that.
That's not what you're saying, though. You're saying cases that we know where intelligence, where data is created, we're seeing this in examples of human intelligence or in general. But then you're jumping to say, well, this looks like data, this looks like code, therefore it must have been created in the same thing. You're making a false analogy there.
Well,
you're saying...
I'm not making an analogy at all. I mean, DNA is code. DNA is information, and
well, then you're making a claim. Then, yeah. Well, DNA is code is one way to say it, but it's not the same computer programmer would make, and that's where the analogy is being made. You're using the word code.
So, do you deny then that DNA is information?
No, I don't deny that it's information. It's the building blocks of life, man. It's like,
okay.
But what I don't do is say that all the other instances where I see that there's information was created by an intelligence, therefore I can justify that DNA was also created by an intelligence. Evidence to that for that claim. It's too large of a leap to make.
All right, so let's say you're an archaeologist in that you're digging and you find hieroglyphics on the side of a wall or something that you uncovered. Do you think you're justified based on your previous experience that this information came from?
Yeah, sure, I am, but that's different because I can compare that to other things that I know, other writings, other hieroglyphics. I can compare that to what walls look like when there is no writing on there, what a non-designed wall looks like, wall that's designed with writing on it. I can't compare natural DNA to DNA that's not like it. They're different. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but
All right, so you do agree then that DNA is information. So then what about the other premise? Do you think information can come from a source other than a mind?
So by me saying the DNA doesn't mean that I'm saying it's information in the same way that we see information. All right, so
what's
I'm not going to make.
Right. Then what would you say is the difference, the distinction? Like, what are the different types of information?
So this goes back to the origins of life, right? And so we don't know what first thing, what the conditions were in the primordial soup to spark life. We don't know what that was. We can't test that. We can't go back in time. But yet, so is a sufficient answer. I don't have to know that answer to be okay with it. I can just say I don't know, and maybe one day we'll find.
Okay, and you're fine with doing that. Like, if you want to say, I don't know what did it, that is acceptable. But then I don't see you can rule out intelligent design. That seems to implicitly concede that intelligence is the only known explanation for information, and therefore the best explanation for the origin of the information in DNA. If you're just going to say, well, I don't know, and not offer another better or superior explanation, then that wouldn't refute the argument for intelligent design from the information in DNA.
Sure. I mean, I can't reply to that because I'm not a geneticist. I don't know those things, so I'm not qualified to make that claim. So, I mean, did you want to talk about that some more? Because
no, we can move on if you want.
I got one for you guys.
Well,
yeah.
Can I ask a question real quick, David? So the irreducible complexity. So, in fact, if you're going to say that something is irreducibly complex and requires a designer, then you're basically going to get into an infinite regress, because it would have also had to been irreducibly complex, and that designer would have also had to been irreducibly complex. And then so, are you saying that there's an infinite number of gods who designed one another, or is it an argument of special pleading, basically, that say this doesn't apply to the?
I would challenge your premise that the designer is irreducibly complex. On what basis do you make that claim?
The designer doesn't have to be irreducibly complex, then why does the bacterial flagellum? I don't.
Well, we can empirically observe that the bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex, but you then made the claim that therefore the designer must be irreducibly complex, and I'm curious as to why.
Well, in order for something to have to be more complex than the system that it's designed, I mean, if it has the power to create irreducibly complex. I just want to throw that out, special pleading, but.
Sure. I don't think it is special pleading, because whoever is saying that the designer is irreducibly complex would have to verify that, right? Intelligent design is interested in what we empirically observe in the world, and as far as we can tell, the designer is not part of the world, so there's no markers on this designer for us to know whether it's irreducibly complex or not. And when it comes down to it, as you know, if we are to conclude based on the grounds of other arguments that the designer is God, as I personally believe he is, then he's not complex in a physical sense anyway. So that would just seem to be something of a non sequitur.
Okay.
All right, so gentlemen, we're going to wrap it up here in a couple of minutes. I just had one more question for both of you. Stephen Jay Gould said Neo-Darwinism dead. What he meant by that, I don't know, because it hasn't stopped anybody from holding fast to it. I don't know why Royal Society in 2017 opened its doors and brought the third way and the intelligent design guys of the Discovery Institute in there to talk about the troubles facing and its model. Any of you guys, go ahead. Don't wait on me.
Do you want to take this one, Jared?
Knowledge of that, I have no knowledge of that whatsoever. But I don't think Neo-Darwinism's dead. I haven't. The only people that would say it was dead is That's not even a proper term.
Well,
Proponents of intelligent design.
well, Stephen Jay Gould is definitely not an ID guy. Matter of fact, he's yeah. I mean, it was just something in 2017 that I observed.
Yeah, I'll
and I was
comment on
just
that.
wondering if you guys had anything to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what he's getting at there is that the modern evolutionary synthesis, Neo-Darwinism, is dying. It's in its last days, and intelligent design proponents have predicted this a long time ago. But now the rest of biology is finally beginning to figure it out, and this is why we have things like, they're not all coming over to intelligent design, so I'm not saying that. But this is why we have like the extended evolutionary synthesis is becoming a big thing. So we've got like Evo-Devo, process structuralism. These are becoming bigger, right? So I'm not saying Neo-Darwinism has been like overthrown yet. I'd say it's still a dominant position, but it is definitely undergoing major revisions, and this is being acknowledged. You know, not just by intelligent design people. Again, this is being acknowledged by top scientists.
Well, I would hope so. That's how science works. We're constantly models on our hypothesis. Like, so if it wasn't doing that, then I would be worried. But to say that it's dying and then to say that it's going under some very different things.
Well,
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I have a question for you, Pallmann. When I searched intelligent, and try to challenge you since David threw one at Jared. When I searched intelligent or Googled intelligent design, the Wikipedia page, the first thing it said is scientific theory, right? And that seems to be kind of what you catch, you know, within the mainstream, is that this is laughable as young Earth creationism, and certainly not as laughable as flat Earth, but it is kind of heading in that direction. A lot of people, and maybe you would challenge that idea, but it's certainly the minority. So why do you feel like you have the why do you think you're qualified as sort of a layman in the area of biology to challenge what the mainstream holds?
Well, all right, so there's kind of two things there. One, you were saying that intelligent design is not scientific, or that's the popular opinion, and then why do I think I get to talk about this? Because, you know, who am I, the guy who just studies ministry and apologetics, who's in his third year at a seminary. So let me take the first question first. First, I want to say that intelligent design, if it's not science, then neither is Darwinism, because intelligent design uses the same principles as Darwin used to formulate his theory. Darwin tried to formulate his theory based to explain features in the present. He tried to explain it by reference to, or to explain the past, so how we got to the present. He tried to explain these features or these effects by reference to causes that were known to produce those effects in the present. So he thought natural selection could accomplish this level of change. He observed that acting in the present, so he extrapolated that to the past and said, this is how we could explain the past. Intelligent design does the same thing. We say we can observe what intelligent agents do in the present. We extrapolate that to explain the past. So if anyone wants to say intelligent design is not science, then they've lost Darwinism too, because it uses the exact same methodology. As to why I'm qualified to talk about this, I am most definitely not. This is why I pull on the work of those who are. I work off of the work of guys like Jonathan Wells and guys like Stephen Meyer and guys like Michael Behe and Ann Gager and people who are real scientists. I try to study them, be as prepared as possible, but I'm using the arguments of scientists. So these are not, you know, my own arguments.
That's great. Yeah. And anything you want to say, Jared, in close, wrap this up. We'll let you have the last word as the courteous three Christians.
That's fine. Yeah, I don't think that intelligent design it's not. Science deals with things in nature. It has to give hypotheses which can be tested. What intelligent design doing is making inferences. And inferences are not science. You keep using the word Darwinism or Darwin to be a Darwinist. Like, Darwin is like the poster child for evolution, but yet his theories have been built on and improved ever since. Back to Darwin, it's kind of a cheap shot, I think. But yeah, I would just say that you have to present some empirical data. You can't just claim that a supernatural or intelligent designer design this stuff without proof that they did it. So until you can do that, there is no claim to be made. It's basically just an assertion without evidence. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So
classic skeptic line to close the show with. Thanks so much for coming on. Once again, you can find Jared at the Reason2Doubt podcast, wherever you find your podcasts. And
Number
make
two.
Sure, no, number two. Yes. And you can find David Pallmann on YouTube at Faith Because of Reason. And like I said, more to this show in the future. We'll see what all of the raving fans think of his performance. And yeah, I'll definitely keep everyone updated on my new product. Like I said, it might be a while before it comes out, but I'll make sure to plug it very heavily on this podcast when it does come out. I reserve the right to do that. That's in the fine print. Thank you guys once again for coming on. And yeah, David, anything you want to say as we wrap this up?
I won't.
Thank you guys for coming on. I had fun.
Yeah, I meant David Russell, but David Pallmann responded as well. If you guys are going to be running this show, you're going to have to figure something out with that.
I thought you were calling him Russell.
Yeah. I was. I said I was, and I lied.
All right.
All right, guys. Make
Thanks for
sure
having
to
me.
share this. Make sure to share this podcast with all of your friends. Subscribe, rate, and review podcast. And yeah, thanks, Pallmann and Jared, for coming on again. We'll see you guys later.
Yeah, no problem.